Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who can help you communicate more effectively, whether that's one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Dave Bricker. Here's 3 facts that I believe you should know about Dave. 1, he's sailed thousands of miles in search of stories, not gold, but stories. 2, he's an award-winning speaker who's authored 12 books. And 3, he's a business storytelling expert who helps professionals discover what to say and how to say it. Dave Bricker, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, thanks for having me today. It's an honor.
David, it's delightful to be talking with you, and and I wish that there are times that I could have been out there sailing across the ocean with you, because there's something about just getting lost in the ocean that must be soothing and stimulating to the imagination. Do you find a lot of your stories come from that sailing experience?
Absolutely, because in storytelling, it's so important to make your story a metaphor for your listener's story. Because if you talk about yourself for too long, well, narcissism is the only disease in the world where the sicker you are, the better you feel, right? So you have a certain amount of time where you can talk about yourself, and then you'd better make it about the audience. But everybody has oceans to cross. Everybody has bridges to cross. There are these universal themes. So this sailing metaphor works very well. So the short answer is yes.
And so I'm hearing you're saying there that even though not everyone is a sailor, not everyone has sailed, not everyone likes sailing, but you're saying that they can still connect with your story because
everybody is on a journey. And without a journey, stories are all about that journey through life, that journey through raising a family, that journey through growing a business, that journey through bringing a new employee on board and bringing them into the culture of your company and making them part of the overall story. There are journeys and sub-journeys. And so it doesn't matter if you're training for a marathon or sailing across an ocean or climbing a mountain. All of these things are metaphors for the journeys that your audience is on.
And how might a business leader use those metaphors in day-to-day talking to staff?
That's a great question. And I think that to do this effectively, you might look at a situation, talking to staff. So, for example, you can go in and you can challenge somebody's leadership. Maybe you've got a manager who's just running ineffective, boring meetings because they're kind of doing what a lot of people do. They come in and they tick the boxes, but they're not doing what Ernest Shackleton did when he had to get his men off the ice in the Antarctic, right? And he kept them together. They're not necessarily showing the leadership, or they're leading with authority and telling people what to do, but they're not leading by inspiring people. So maybe instead of coming in and giving somebody a data dump about what they're doing right and wrong in terms of their leadership, tell a story about Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer, or any number. Talk about how Winston Churchill kept Britain together during the Blitz, during World War II, and kept the spirit of the country high under terrible circumstances. There are other types of leadership, but you're not going to get into somebody's head by starting with the word you and saying you did this or you didn't do that. But if you say, let me tell you a story, and that story provides a metaphor, then people open up and listen because they're not feeling confronted.
So you suggested Ernest Shackleton, Winston Churchill as possible subjects for stories. So that suggests that the story doesn't necessarily have to be one that the storyteller experienced themselves.
No, and look, if you can come up with something in your own life, that's great. It can be, let me tell you about my kid's baseball team and how he started off as just feeling with low self-esteem and low performance, but he had this great coach. And by the end of the season, he had turned around. I mean, it can be, the joke is, right, size doesn't matter, right? We all have stories of our pets, stories of our relationships, stories of travel. And very often the best and funniest stories are the biggest disaster stories, things that we've come through. And any story, whether it's yours or whether it's even true or not, I always encourage people to be a journeyist, not a journalist. If the story is not a lie, if you're not deceiving somebody, whatever story will work to create that metaphor that transforms the listener, that gets them to think differently, then let it go.
The story doesn't have to be true. That concept might upset a lot of people. And how do you counsel them to get over it?
Well, let's think about some of our favorite stories. First of all, we raise our children on stories that aren't true. We call them fables, things like that. Our favorite stories, I mean, nobody's coming after Dan Brown for lying, right? I mean, these are best-selling books, and we know that they're fictional, but whether the goal is to entertain us or enlighten us, as long as we're not misrepresenting something, trying to get somebody to think something is true that isn't, then life doesn't unfold in tidy chapters. Things happen in odd orders. It's only in books and movies that things go boom, 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 and they're nice and linear. Somebody's got to mess with the story to turn it into a teaching instrument.
So it's one thing to claim that, well, I climbed Mount Everest, but you didn't. So, or I won a gold medal, but you didn't. So those are clear out lies. However, you could tell a story of someone who did climb Mount Everest, or perhaps you could make up you could tell a fictional event of, here's a team that's preparing and here's what they encountered along the way, without saying that was you.
Exactly. And if you can't find something in your own experience, then make something up. Say, let me tell you about a mountain climbing team. And if somebody wants to go after the fact and say, I researched it and I couldn't find any evidence of that, it's like, you just missed the point. Did you learn something from the story? And the other side of that is, if you and I had an experience, even recording this podcast, and if we got together in 3 months and somebody interviewed us and asked us to tell our impressions of how did that go, what did we talk about, chances are we would come up with very different accounts. We would remember different things because of our own biases. We would forget things because of our own biases. And whatever the true truth is, who knows?
Do you, in your storytelling, do you use stories outside of the sailing experience?
Sure. I mean, now my brand is StorySailing. So I tend to use those nautical stories because I've got a huge collection of them, but they're popular stories like The Frog and the Scorpion that we've all heard, or one of my favorite stories, and it's great for business. And I'll, if you have a moment, I'll tell it because it's very short. It's the ant and the centipede, and the ant walks by and he sees the centipede and he says, "Oh, how do you walk with all of those hundreds of legs? That's just remarkable. I get 6 and I'm getting tied up." And the centipede kind of pokes his head up and looks at him condescendingly and says, "Oh, my boy, it's easy. I take the odd leg. No, wait a second. I take the odd legs on this side and the even legs. No, that's not it either." Anyway, after a while, the ant kind of shrugs and decides to move on. And he passes by an hour later, and the centipede's still tied up in knots, trying to explain what it was that he did naturally. Obviously not a true story, because ants and centipedes don't talk, but we have so many virtuosic people who are so natural at what they do, but very often they're terrible teachers.
Aha, good lesson. Next time I see a centipede, I won't tie them all up in knots by saying, "Tell me how you do that," because that's amazing. Right. How do you get all those legs moving together?
Yeah, and sometimes the virtuosos are not the best teachers. I mean, you're a coach, right? How many people do you coach where you don't know their industry, but you understand how to help them identify their blind spots? You don't have to be an expert in manufacturing to coach someone in the manufacturing business. Now, they need a mentor in the business, but as far as being a business coach, you need to help them identify their strengths, their weaknesses, their goals, their blocks. And that's a completely different skill set than being a manufacturing expert.
That's remarkably true. We can be good at what we do. However, we all have blind spots, and we need other people to point out those blind spots to us. And certainly I do that when I work with business leaders. I help them. I point out the communication blind spots. Now, one of the areas, of course, that they all can get better at is telling stories. And if a business leader has a message to deliver to the team, perhaps it's the monthly meeting, and the message is about, it has to be about, okay, we've got a challenge, things are different, things are uncertain. How can that leader come up with a story that helps them get the message across? Where do they go?
Well, first thing is, let's figure out what it is you're going to talk about. And the golden rule of storytelling is that stories are always about people. If you're not talking about people, you're not telling stories. If you're not telling stories, you're not connecting. And if you're not connecting, you're not selling. And I see the look. What is this about selling? This is not a sales presentation, but selling is not the art of getting people to part with their money. Selling is the art of demonstrating that you are worth getting to know, worth liking, worth trusting. The transaction is a byproduct of the selling, not the direct result of the selling. And if you're speaking to a group of people, you need to sell your credibility, you need to sell your leadership, you need to sell your ideas. So if you're talking about prices, processes, ingredients, or data, you're not talking about people. As soon as you start putting all that stuff up on these busy slides, you've lost your audience. So stories are always about people, because outcomes are for people. Results are for people. And there's a meaning. So if you're talking about the transformation, where is it that you want to take your audience? Anytime you've got a message for an audience, whether it's the person you're asking for a raise from, whether it's the person you're asking for better performance from, or whether it's an auditorium full of people, how do you have to know in advance, how do you want them to think, feel, or act differently? Because if you don't have a clear idea of what the goal is, then you're just up there using up oxygen for no good reason, and people are just going to tune you out. Understand the transformation, and then understand the authentic conflict in the story. What is getting in the way of the transformation? And very often, the conflict is not what people think it is. So conflict is something that takes place really on a survival level, on an amygdala level, on an instinctive level. So if, for example, everybody, we'd all love to make more money. But if you act like a child and you keep asking why, our kids have all done that. And finally we say, because I said so. We become that parent we swore we'd never become. But if we keep asking why, we get down to something like, well, I want to make sure that, my family is taken care of when I'm gone, or I want to send my kids to college, or I want to make sure that if I get sick, that I'm covered and my family doesn't end up with nothing. Whatever it is, people are concerned with food, love, shelter, sex, status, really survival level issues. And these are the authentic conflicts. So money is great, but money is just a tool with which we use to buy things that are meaningful to us. And so figuring out what's that journey from conflict to transformation.
Conflict, is that a critical element to a good story?
Absolutely. Because if I say, George, I got to tell you about yesterday, I went out for a walk and nothing happened. And you're thinking, why is he telling me this? Why is he wasting my time? But if I say, I went out for a walk and I met the most amazing person, or I went out for a walk and all of a sudden I was approached by these 3 thugs, or I went out for a walk and I found a kitten, whatever it is, all of a sudden you're thinking, okay, what happened next? There's a conflict. What did you do with the kitten? How did you deal with the thugs? And without a conflict, we just have, even the news, even journalism, they're not going to write on the front page, hey, nothing happened today. The advertisers aren't going to stay on board.
Now, that phrase, what happened next? Do you suggest that's a trigger question that's a question that you want to trigger in the minds of your listeners? So you build your story, so that's the reaction that you get, and then you can deliver the outcome of the story. Is that kind of the plan?
Yeah, which is why first chapters of novels, opening scenes in screenplays, all of this stuff is critical, because if you can't hook them at the beginning of your speech, and it's not just the words, it's the delivery, it's those long pauses, it's the difference between saying, I've got something really important to share with you today. We're going to talk about storytelling. Okay, not very exciting. I've got something really important to talk to you today about. Today, we're going to talk about storytelling. Now, all of a sudden, you're making them lean forward in their seats. You're making them wait for it. You've told them you have something important, and then you're giving them that space to process that. Or maybe you just launch into a story, and 10 seconds later, they're out in the Gulf Stream in a storm with you, or in a storm on the side of Mount Everest, or 18 miles into a marathon and running out of steam, whatever it is. It's put them into the story, and then all of a sudden they are in your story. They have forgotten that they're sitting in a chair next to a bunch of people, and there's this perpetual state of what happens next.
How do you know, if you're the storyteller, how do you know if your listener feels like they're in your story?
I love that question. I've actually told sea stories, and I've had people look visibly seasick. People will get into a story. We stepped out of the wilderness 20,000 years ago. In evolutionary time, that's nothing. 10,000 years ago, we were still hunting mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. In our current state, we're just babies. So we're hunter-gatherers at heart, and our natural state is to scan for threats and scan for opportunities. And then all of a sudden, something comes along and it asks us to pay attention. It's either a threat or an opportunity, right? If you stand on a corner in the city and you look up at the buildings, somebody's going to come and see you looking up, and they're going to go, either something's falling that's going to crush me, or it's going to make me rich, or something's going on up there, but what is it? You stop and pay attention, right? And it's fascinating. Now, if you don't keep their attention, they're going to go, oh, it's just a bird, who cares? And they're going to go back to their cell phone and checking their email, because that's where the threats or opportunities are going to be coming from, right? Somebody's going to communicate with me. But if there's an opportunity, all of a sudden, you've got a whole crowd of people staring up, watching what's happening up at the top of that building there, and waiting for the money to fall, or waiting for the conflict to be resolved, or whatever it is. And now they are scanning for threats and opportunities in your story, and you are the guide. You're not the hero of the story, but if somebody's out on a boat in the Gulf Stream with me in a storm, and most people in my audiences are not blue water sailors, and so they're looking to me to get safely out of that situation, because they're there on the boat with me. And you can see in their faces, the looks on their faces, that they are totally transformed. Now, you get in trouble for doing this, but if you went in a movie theater and you stood in front of the screen and looked back at the audience, you would probably see the same thing. As a matter of fact, you'd get all sorts of popcorn and cups and things thrown at you, because you're interrupting this experience that people are having inside the story.
Inside the story. Dave, can you take us inside a story? You've sailed across the ocean, you've sailed thousands of miles. Can you take us inside a story of one of your scariest moments while being out on the ocean?
So I was 25 years old, sailing my 26-foot boat. This wasn't the ocean crossing. This was actually after the ocean crossing. But I was sailing back from the Bahamas to Miami after about 14 months away. And I left on a winter night, a January night, left in the afternoon. And it started off just beautiful. The first 6 or 8 hours, no, it's only 45 miles from the Bahamas to Miami. You're out of sight of land, but it's not that far a trip. So I left in the afternoon, hoping to sail through the night and get in the morning in better light. And after dark, it got colder, and the wind got higher, and it got colder, and it got rougher. And pretty soon I was out there in some of the roughest weather I had ever seen. I shortened my sails. I kept going. There was nothing else I could do but keep going. I really couldn't go back. I couldn't land in the Bahamas in the dark. It's not very well lit. There's reefs. And okay, I kept on going. And pretty soon my path converged with 3 ships, 2 freighters and an enormous cruise ship. And I knew that they couldn't see me, because I was in a tiny boat in big seas. And when I looked up to the top of my mast, my light was going dim. My battery was dying. So I'm invisible. And these ships can't see me, even on their radars in the big waves. The waves are bigger than my boat. It's the only time I've ever lashed myself into the cockpit, waves breaking over. So I dodged the 2 freighters and kept on going. And my course was really converging with the cruise ship, but I was able to cut behind it at the last minute. And I could hear the throbbing of the engines. And as I cut behind the cruise ship and I looked up into that aft deck, I could see the flashing lights of the disco and kind of hear that sound, that muffled sound from the disco, and the silhouettes of people dancing. And I thought, my God, these people are having an entirely different experience in the same place at the same time. I'm fighting for survival, and they're all fighting to get to the bar for their 3rd margarita, and they don't even know I'm here. And it was just this incredible realization. And it makes me wonder how many people listening to us today feel like that in their businesses, that they're out there in these rough seas and nobody can see them. And there are these enormous opportunities going by, these freighters and cruise ships. And they're like, hello, either do some business with me or stay out of my way, but don't run me over. They wouldn't even know, right? and this idea of communication and visibility and things like that. Now, this is a story I tell in a slightly longer version at the beginning of my keynote, but the point comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's my story. And yeah, it's a scary sea story, but why do you care about it? Because it's a metaphor for your journey in business. Because we all want to get those big clients and big opportunities and get noticed, and we all feel invisible.
Now, I was, while you're telling that story, I certainly felt like I was there with you on the boat, and I could see these hulks, you know, the freighter and the cruise ship especially. And normally you would think of them as just being benign, but now in this case, they're threats to your life. And
yeah.
And so I see now it's, I see a number of messages and points that you can take out of that story. So one, you put people into the story, and they feel like they're there with you. I'm guessing that when you make the point, when you draw the metaphor, that point is now remembered better. It sinks in because of the story.
Well, they've just had an emotional experience, right? I mean, they're out there in a life-threatening situation. And then there are some other things I do that are more on the delivery side, like making the all of a sudden, like, well, I can see it, I can hear that, right? The sound of the engine. Getting into some of the sensory stuff there brings that experience home. It's not just journalism anymore. It's like, oh wow, I'm there, and I'm visualizing, even looking up at the stern of the ship, and the flashing lights and the silhouettes of the dancers, right? I paint a very specific picture of that moment for my listener, and it takes them there.
And so I'm reminded, so as I'm watching you and hearing you deliver that story, so it's not just a matter of narrating the words in a monotone, it's deliver and perform the story so that people receive more inputs. It's more emotional, more visceral. And I'm reminded of, it's been many years, it's been decades actually, when I used to read fairy tales and fables to my children, and I would do it, you know, and you have that storytelling voice, you know, there was Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and you tell it, and, you know, or 'twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, and you use your storytelling voice with your children. But I wonder how many business leaders remember to do that when they're telling their stories to their team or to their clients, that they need to perform the story. Is that what you help them remember?
Absolutely, because people are afraid of that kind of performance. They think it's theatrical. They worry it's over the top. They worry it's unprofessional. And you know, when we're little kids, we get to a certain age where, you know, we like to run around and scream and yell on the playground, and little kids have voices that are just, you know, 10 times as big as they are. And sooner or later, somebody says, come on, chill out, use your inside voice, act civilized. I think the ladies get it earlier than the men do. But somebody says, you know, calm down, act civilized, be professional. And we get trained not to use our voices. And certainly there are places to just be cool and be low key. But if you're trying to make a point, you're not screaming at your audience. You're using messaging techniques that are going to get you listened to. And people are going to listen to you if your message is interesting and entertaining, engaging, dynamic. So like that example I used in the beginning, where, hey, today we're going to talk about something special, storytelling. Or today we're going to talk about something special. Long pause. Oh, they're almost going to fall over their chairs. Storytelling, right? And what can you do? Asking questions. If you ask a question in a speech, give your audience space to answer it. If you tell a joke, I was coaching a speaker in a humorous speech contest, and her jokes were funny. And she asked me, why is nobody laughing? Because you're finishing the joke and moving on to the next one. Your audience doesn't want to interrupt you. Tell the joke, leave the space. And she won that competition 3 days later because she practiced leaving the spaces and she was astonished. But sometimes it's what you don't say. The impact of your words is not really in the words. It lives in the echo of your words.
The echo of your words. That resonates. Now, Dave, you mentioned one mistake when people don't allow the audience to have that space. What other mistakes have you find that speakers make, especially when it comes to stories, and what can they do about that?
Well, the number one mistake speakers make is they talk about themselves. And even in the introduction, how many times have you been to the Chamber of Commerce breakfast and the introduction goes on and on about the degrees the person has and the companies they've worked for and with? And it's like, do we care? No, we just don't. What's in it? So you got to start out with some value proposition for the audience. And anybody who knows anything about sales understands you want to lead with that value proposition. And whether that comes in the form of a story or a joke or whatever, you've got to make it about the audience. And this is also the solution. People are nervous, naturally nervous, speaking in front of an audience. And I always say, turn nervous into service, which means if you're thinking about your fear, you're thinking about yourself and how you're going to get through the 40 minutes or whatever it is. Think about your audience and how you're going to serve them. The time has come. The rehearsal is over. You're out on the platform, or you're in front of the conference room, or you're at the one-on-one. It doesn't matter. Meeting has started. Time to start thinking about your listeners. Because otherwise you're just, indulging yourself or worrying about yourself at the expense of the effectiveness of your presentation.
Thoughtful advice. So if you're thinking about, if you're afraid, if you're focusing on your fear, you're focusing on yourself. And the way to get by that is to think about the experience for the listener.
Absolutely. And look, you're still going to be afraid, and that's normal. But, people, okay, you're afraid. If you're not afraid, you're not living life, right? I mean, I'm afraid every time I speak. Is this audience going to like me? Is my message going to be on the mark? I mean, we all battle the demons of self-doubt. I'm no superhero. I'm like everybody else. And you've worked with executives, and you've seen once you get them alone and talking frankly, and the imposter syndrome comes out, and yet they have to be strong leaders, and they can't be so vulnerable in front of their teams, right? And I think business leaders have a very special category of imposter syndrome, self-doubt, and stage fright, because there's very often more on their shoulders.
Dave, where can people go who want help with their speaking? What are the, to find out mistakes to avoid, tips to improve? Where can they go?
Well, I've just released a subscription course called 52speakingblunders.com. And the model's kind of fun because it's 1 3 to 5 minute video every week for 52 weeks. So you don't have to open up a course or put another book on your nightstand that you've finished 2 chapters of. I mean, it's something that people actually enjoy and finish. It's engaging content, and it will make a difference in your speaking. And then my main website is StorySailing.com, and I'm available for coaching, keynotes, workshops, things of that nature.
The 2 websites, that's 52speakingblunders.com to get a hold of that course, that weekly video, 2 to 3 minute video tidbit. And you can reach Dave Bricker directly at his website, StorySailing.com, and you can find those links in the description below. Dave, as we prepare to wrap up, if there's 1 or 2 or maybe 3 pieces of advice that you would give to a leader before they're about to deliver an important presentation, and if the advice is around a story, what would be that advice you'd give them?
Number 1 is always figure out what the outcome is for the audience. How are you going to serve the audience? Don't give them up. Don't get up on the platform and just talk about the last quarter's figures. Talk about what the last quarter's figures mean. Do they mean the team did a great job? Do they mean the team is going to have to work extra hard because there were circumstances beyond their control? Talk about meanings rather than talk about data. The other side of it is, if you don't have training in professional speaking and you need to engage your team, especially if there's a high stakes presentation, work with a coach. Doesn't have to be me, doesn't have to be you, George. I'm sure you're a fantastic coach too, but get with somebody. At very least, join a local Toastmasters chapter and engage. It's a wonderful organization. It's the cheapest professional development in the world and probably one of the most effective programs. Get where you're speaking or evaluating speakers or engaging in that every week, and you will grow and transform.
My guest today is Dave Bricker, reminding you that effective storytelling is about people. If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you convey your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.